I'm not going to talk specifically about planning, because in my mind, planning is part of a much larger system of land governance. My argument in the paper and today in this summary is that understanding the ways in which land is made available for urban development and redevelopment is crucial to understanding the ways in which African towns and cities are evolving, why so many public actions to regulate and guide their growth fail, and how to think about more effective ways of intervening. The debate tends to focus on the failures of formal state land policies and administration processes, the prevalence, as we've been saying already this morning, of informal processes of land delivery and development, and the chaotic and healthy and often slum-like conditions that such informality produces. I argue that traditional ways of understanding urban land and development processes, whether they're those of economists or built environment professionals or drafters of state law, are based on both conceptual and practical misunderstandings of what's really going on. To better conceptualize processes of land delivery and development and redevelopment, we need to adopt a political economy approach. We need to focus on the institutions that govern interactions between the actors involved and not just abstract economic theories. And we need to adopt a legal pluralist approach. We need to move beyond the traditional prior assumptions of economists, as has been said a little bit this morning already, political scientists and land professionals. And we need it to be based on empirical investigations of land development processes. And we need to assess the outcomes and impacts of initiatives to try and improve land policy and administration. We need to assess them more thoroughly. So what the paper will do is to discuss the paper itself is very long, I'm afraid. It discusses a range of issues related to a possible conceptual framework for analysing land delivery and development processes. It reviews evidence on land delivery processes, and it looks at the outcomes of an attempt to assess the social and economic impact of one of the major initiatives which has been widely promoted in recent years, which is extending titling to low and middle income areas. It draws on research in which I've been involved with colleagues, in particular on the supply of land for low-income housing and the impact of extending titling, but it's not confined to those sources. It's an overview, but it can't cover everything. I give less attention to development and redevelopment than to the delivery of land for new development, even though I recognise that already developed areas are constantly being reshaped through transactions and through investment in land and property. Also, I don't have space in the paper to discuss other land governance initiatives to improve policy making, to improve plan preparation and implementation, initiatives to do with development regulation or property taxation or dispute resolution mechanisms. And all of those, I would say, are vital constituents of land governance. I can't summarise what turned out, as I say, as a very long paper, despite leaving out those things which ought to be included in an overall discussion of land governance. And so what I'll do in this presentation is to sketch the main channels for land delivery for urban development, concentrating on a few key features of each, summarise the main findings of our attempt to look at the impact of extending titling, and, if I have time at the end, identify some broad implications for future policy and practice. So we're looking here at channels for land delivery, particularly for low-income housing and associated uses. And there are four main channels which are evident in cities widely in sub-Saharan Africa. First, the allocation of public land. Secondly, customary tenure, land held under customary tenure and its availability for urban development. Thirdly, the transfer of land through markets. And fourthly, what we call self-allocation. Their significance, the relative significance of those, varies from place to place, depending on the pre-colonial governance arrangements, colonial interventions, post-colonial economic trends, regime changes and the policies that go with those, and patterns of land ownership in and around urban centres. Findings from the in-depth studies of 5 Anglophone cities and other researchers' studies of other cities have already been published, and I can't summarise them in any depth here. And so what I'll do is to instead identify just 2 or 3 key features of each of the main channels for land delivery and 1 or 2 insights from our research. The first that I'll look at is the allocation of public land. The stock of land available to the government, which is owned by the government, varies from city to city. It depends on what was inherited from colonial governments. It depends on the ability of post-colonial governments and municipalities to acquire land that's either in customary or private ownership in and around urban areas. It depends on whether or not full-scale land nationalisation was pursued in the 1960s and the 1970s, and whether governments have ever attempted large-scale sites and services programmes. In practice, public land tends to have been made available mainly for investment in infrastructure and social facilities, for formal enterprises, for high-end housing and housing for public sector employees. You're all very familiar with this. Even service plots, again, we're familiar with the outcome of those attempts. They were intended for low-income households, but they've often been allocated to people outside the intended beneficiary group. They're susceptible to downward raiding by middle-income households who are unable to access housing from either public or private official sources, or they're sold by initial allottees who struggle to comply with the requirements for construction and monthly payments. In addition, officials have skewed the allocation process, and they've taken advantage of their position to secure plots for themselves and for those to whom they have social obligations, not always seeing either of those as corrupt. Much of the construction that goes on and many of the subsequent transactions in such plots are informal. Eventually, the volume of unregistered transactions, the prevalence of under-the-counter payments that belied the idea that land had no value, which underlay many attempts at land nationalisation, the adverse effects of bottlenecks in land supply and the rise of market liberalism led to the abandonment of land nationalisation. And today in many cities, the stocks of publicly owned land are limited. Overall, therefore, experience has shown that systems for directly allocating public land for housing development are unresponsive to demand. They give government bodies and officials and their clients unfair advantages, and they're generally inefficiently administered. Even in the few countries where in the past or recently subdivided public land has made a significant contribution to supply, the results are not wholly positive. And this seems to apply regardless of the nature of the regime. It seems to apply whether or not we're talking about an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime. And there are some examples in the paper. The second main channel for the delivery of land for urban purposes is when depends on whether urban centres are located in areas in which the land is held under customary tenure, and the attitudes of colonial and post-independence governments to the role of customary authorities and the status of customary tenure. Land held by indigenous groups can be an important source of land for urban development. Neither the roles and responsibilities of customary authorities nor the administration of customary tenure are traditional in the sense that the contemporary arrangements are the same as the pre-colonial rural arrangements. Even in pre-colonial times, those arrangements were evolving in response to increased population density, conquest and migration, and they've continued to evolve ever since. And so I tend to avoid the use of the word traditional. There are many critics of the idea that customary authorities should continue to play a role in modern states and societies. They're said to be patriarchal, hierarchical, authoritarian, predatory, elitist, with those features contributing to the perpetuation, institutionalization of similar undesirable features in the existing political system, the main state political system, which is fairly universally perceived to be patrimonial, even though the extent to which it's more or less developmental varies from place to place. In almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, the state can be conceived of as a patrimonial state. However, a recent Afrobarometer opinion poll type survey has shown that there is widespread public support for customary authorities in most countries. It demonstrates that they have a continued role and continued legitimacy, not least in the role of state in the face of state failure. But that survey tends to generalize too much for my liking. And I think generalizations about all societies and all levels and types of customary tenure should be avoided. Customary authority should be avoided. Nevertheless, if only for practical reasons, their central role in supplying land for urban areas, with or without official sanction, needs to be recognized and understood. And it's possible, I think, to identify three channels, three sub-pathways, if you like, by which the land is made available. First of all, it provides for the allocation of land to or the inheritance of property by members of the indigenous group, which is one of the only ways in which poor households, some poor households, can access land and property in urban areas today, although generally not women. The institutions that govern entitlements to land and property, the allocation processes and the resolution of dispute mechanisms for resolving disputes, continue to be widely understood and widely accepted by members of the indigenous group. However, rival claims to indigeneity and to land, fraught relationships with government in many places, and exhaustion of the supply of undeveloped land under the control of indigenous groups mean that in many cities, even some members of the indigenous group now have to seek access to land through the market. In addition, determination to secure the benefits of increased land values gives rise to competition between the original owners and the leaseholders to which they've allocated land, and within indigenous groups, with some alleged to be serving their own interests rather than the interest of the group as a whole. The second sub-pathway is the delivery of land through state-sanctioned customary channels. In a few countries, the state has recognized but simultaneously sought to increase its control over the actions of customary authorities by establishing new or recognizing existing bodies responsible for the administration of customary land, for example in Botswana or Ghana. However, the outcomes have been mixed and they're often quite problematic. The third is through the entry of customary land into the market. In many places, there's evidence of land held under customary tenure being sold for urban development in colonial times. And today, this is the main channel for land delivery in many urban centres, regardless of whether or not it's officially sanctioned or tolerated or disapproved of by the government. The institutions on which it depends draw on those that govern land within the groups indigenous to the urban area, but they are generally accepted by the non-indigenes who purchase land through this channel, and they're often adapted for urban use. On the whole, our research showed that they provide purchasers with tenure rights that both sellers and buyers regard as binding. Such groups also acknowledge and make use of state rules and procedures where they're considered to be useful, and they even mimic them in developing their own procedures. Nevertheless, the resilience, I should be moving down this page here, the resilience of those institutions that govern transactions and development are often strained by the process of urban development, leading to abuses such as the multiple sale of plots and increasingly frequent disputes within indigenous groups, between indigenous groups and non-indigenous purchasers, or between them and government, and over subsequent transactions once property is bequeathed and handed on, or sold to somebody else. In some places, adaptations For example, the use of written records and agreements, witnesses to agreements, the establishment of informal registries of property, the use of lawyers to draw up agreements. Those sorts of adaptations ensure the continued operation of informal systems. Often, the transactions are officially recognised by the court system, if not by other government departments. But because the documents are not always valid or trusted, purchasers or their heirs or the people who purchase from them may seek to upgrade their sale agreements to state titles if that is administratively and financially and practically feasible, which it is in some instances but not in others. The third main channel is the transfer of land through markets. I've just discussed one of the sub-markets in land. Like other markets, whether informally titled or informally held land, it does not provide land and property to the poor, but it is an important channel of access for middle and high-income households and formal enterprises. In prime urban locations, market access to land results in new development, often gated communities, the intensification of existing uses, redevelopment and often gentrification, which set processes of market-driven displacement in motion. Pushed by domestic and foreign investors, including members of the diaspora, governments attempt to make land administration more responsive to investor requirements. But high prices and continued restrictions mean that titled land is not available through the market to middle and low-income households. And there's nothing new in saying that. But some middle-income and in certain circumstances lower-income households do purchase land through what you might call hybrid arrangements. For example, land buying groups in Kenya that provide ownership rights with more or less security and government recognition short of full title. In certain circumstances, these institutional arrangements can provide large volumes of relatively affordable plots. They draw on social rules that are familiar to people from customary tenure arrangements, adapting them when necessary, and they borrow selectively from state rules when that seems necessary and feasible. However, ethnic mixing, urban pressures, and ineffective land administration may threaten the effectiveness of these arrangements and the social institutions by which they're regulated, leading more of those acquiring plots to seek to register formal titles to their plots. The last channel we call self-allocation because our informants do not like being called squatters or invaders. Traditionally, of course, it has been called squatting. And in the past, it's been a significant way of accessing land for low and often middle-income urban residents and smaller micro-enterprises. It's never been unorganized. It's always been governed by the selective use of customary or political and bureaucratic institutions. While initial access may be non-commercial in the sense that people don't buy land as you might in a market, subsequently, markets in land and property develop within informal settlements, and they may or may not be regularized by government. Today, views seem to differ on the availability of self-allocation to urban households, with some suggesting that squatting is increasing. For example, there is several times in the UN Habitat 2010 State of African Cities report, it is asserted that squatting is increasing. But our research showed that and other people's research showed that the scope for it has so decreased in recent years that it plays only a very limited role in enabling urban households to access land for housing. Now I want to move on to the second main thing that I deal with in the paper, which is looking at the outcomes. It's remarkably rare that you get proper evaluations of things which are pushed all around the world by international experts and institutions, in particular the World Bank. International experts meaning Lesotho, of course, and the World Bank being the lead international institution that has pushed the extension of full titling to new and regularized low and middle income housing areas. It's clear that in practice, there has been very little progress with actual rolling out titling on a large scale in most African countries, and there has been very little evaluation of whether or not, when implemented, it does have the anticipated outcomes. And so we, again with colleagues, studies were undertaken in Dakar and in Ekurhuleni, and they found that in practice, whether intended or not, titling is an incremental process which is very rarely completed, either because the government capacity to complete it is limited or because allottees don't regard the additional benefits of full title as being worth the costs. In providing this quick summary, like all the speakers have said, there is a real danger of overgeneralizing. But nevertheless, our studies, plus other studies that have been done in other parts of the world, show that titling does provide security of tenure to many of those issued with titles, and that may benefit some particularly disadvantaged groups, for example, women heads of household who really value title. But good enough security is often provided by recognition or registrating short of titling. And I'm deliberately borrowing from Merrilee Grindle's Good Enough Governance, which I think provides some very interesting counter-arguments to the good governance arguments. Increased investment in housing does not necessarily follow the issue of titles. Levels of investment are limited primarily by the low incomes of those concerned, and they may be as high in unregularized settlements with perceived security as in titled areas. Thirdly, few households obtain access to institutional credit. Even fewer use such loans for business purposes, and hardly any use their property as collateral, partly because banks are unwilling to accept family homes in low-income areas for this purpose, partly because households don't regard their property as commodities, and partly because the risk of losing their only significant asset is too great, thereby undermining the SUTU's main argument. Fourthly, there's very little evidence that titling results in increased municipal revenue in our two case study cities through extending property taxation. And there are examples of revenue being increased through approaches short of full titling. Fifthly, although titling does reduce asset poverty, there's very little evidence of what impact it has, if any, on income poverty. I think I'm up to sixthly. It's anticipated that titling will stimulate property markets by reducing transaction costs and encouraging investment in property. However, the research shows that relatively few middle and low income areas sell their houses, except in gentrifying areas. Those that do sell are often driven by necessity rather than the desire to realize capital gains. And often, the price realized is less than the market value or less than construction costs. While regularization and registration and titling do have effects on formal and informal markets, those effects are unpredictable, they vary according to local circumstances, and they may be undesirable, both from the perspective of the public interest and the perspective of the lower income occupiers. An individualistic approach to titling fails to recognize the complexity of rights that people claim in practice, particularly in areas governed by customary tenure institutions. And it fails to recognize the very different characteristics and needs of households. In addition, its effects may be lessened or counteracted if related issues such as service delivery or housing finance are not dealt with. So titling may or may not lead to increased security for lower income households, increased property values, and increased revenue. So to move on to the conclusion, it's unhelpful and inaccurate to categorize land delivery and development processes as either legal or illegal, formal or informal, state or non-state. All the channels of land delivery for affordable housing and the outcomes of attempts to extend registration and titling indicate that legal orders other than state law, including planning law, looking at the earlier speakers, are important sources of institutions governing transactions in land and property. No contemporary processes of subdivision and development are compliant with all the formal requirements or wholly informal. Even in the most informal processes, actors interact with the state, they mimic state procedures, they can see the benefits of state procedures, some of them, and they selectively respect state institutions. Land development processes governed by non-state institutions deliver large amounts of land for urban development, and they continue to function relatively well despite the lack of public sector support, despite the increased stresses, and despite the criticism of the customary authorities where they are involved. That's not to say they work well in all respects. Often the land supplied, as we all know, is in inappropriately located and hard-to-service areas. The areas that are needed for public purposes are not necessarily safeguarded, although sometimes they are, and poor quality living environments often result. But the evidence suggests that for land, as for many other aspects of governance and service delivery, policy and practice in the public sector needs to work with the grain of existing processes and institutions, rather than imposing formal, elaborate and inappropriate systems based on idealized views of how markets work and what states can do. I want to draw on, have I got any time left, Andrew? A few minutes. Okay, so I will look at some extremely broad and sketchy implications for policy and practice. The government of land for urban development requires what has been termed a complex service delivery configuration with several components to it. The central state has to play a key role, we can't do without the central state, in devising the legal and administrative frameworks for this. But many elements need to be devised or adapted and implemented at the local level to reflect local variations in the demand for and the supply of land and property, to reflect local variations in land ownership patterns and tenure arrangements, local variations in institutional arrangements, the norms and rules that govern interactions between actors, the modes of local governance. It's possible to identify a whole range of different modes of local governance, the sources of authority, the sources of those social institutions, and they occur in different configurations in different places with different implications for power relationships, to take account of local political culture, in short. There are many policy inconsistencies and inefficiencies in the public land administration that need to be tackled. But we need to scale down our expectations that the state can control urban development processes and land transactions. So it's also vital to engage with, to support, or at the very least tolerate, because support often wrecks things, at least it does often when the state gets involved. So at least tolerate and try and institutionalize the real processes that are delivering large volumes of land for urban development, while supporting municipalities to play guiding and coordinating roles. But this must not be naive. It requires an understanding of the power relations within and outside the government system, and it needs a balance between the institutions that serve the interests of the actors involved with wider policy objectives. If they don't serve the interests of any actors, the institutions are not going to work. But if they serve the interests of some actors selectively, and they don't serve wider policy objectives, then that's not satisfactory either. So some balance is needed. It requires changes to the state land administration system, clearly, to improve policy coherence, to enforce discipline and performance standards within state agencies, as also suggested by the Africa Power and Politics Research Programme, which is looking much more broadly at local public service delivery. Resistance to such changes is inevitable. Not only do many political and bureaucratic actors adhere to a statist view of how to achieve development, They have professional and personal interests in ensuring things continue to be done in the same way as they are now, despite their obvious failings, and we touched on that earlier this morning. Many believe that state law and institutions should be dominant despite government's lack of capacity and legitimacy, and that prevents them from seeing how prevailing everyday processes of land delivery and development might be adopted or adapted to replace or redesign government arrangements that only influence a small proportion of all development. Nevertheless, reforms to public sector organisation and institutions are needed to resource them properly, provide them with realistic and clearly defined organisational mandates, strengthen the incentives for coordination and improve performance. And in addition, of course, accountability needs to be improved through making information on land and planning more available and transparent, and working on the relationships between elected and bureaucratic decision makers and between different levels of government. However, the empirical analysis contained in the paper reveals the limitations to the existing government arrangements for land administration in the face of the complexity of claims to land and the complexity of the processes by which it is actually exchanged and subdivided and developed and redeveloped, as well as the issues involved in registration and titling. There are already indications that some of those who have been promoting the extension of full titling to new and regularised middle-income and low-income housing areas for ideological or economic or political reasons are backtracking. It's most noticeable in the literature published by the World Bank. They're beginning to recognise that few of its supposed benefits have been or can be realised in practice, that its administrative and financial demands exceed the resources available in most sub-Saharan African countries, and that for many of its intended beneficiaries, it's neither desired nor beneficial if other institutions can be relied on to provide them with sufficiently secure tenure and a relatively affordable and livable environment. On the whole, therefore, ways of registering tenure on a large scale short of full titling are likely to serve the majority middle and low-income population who've accessed land through informal channels better than full titling. Also, these sorts of approaches are less likely to have undesirable market distorting and other adverse effects than attempts to extend titling, which are almost always small-scale, costly, and very slow. That's not to say the title registration system can be discarded or neglected. For many, including women, it will continue to be important, and there is considerable scope for streamlining and improving it, as well as other vital aspects of land governance. Processes of planning and development regulation, systems of property taxation, mechanisms for dispute resolution. I'm not going to say anything about those. I'm just putting them in again at the end to say that I see the issues of tenure that I've been mainly talking about, of land delivery, as being part of a broader system of land governance, which needs to be considered in policy and practice terms, in administrative and political terms, as an interconnected system. Thank you.